Each fall we talk to farmers who are considering taking out their CRP or alfalfa, and there are some steps that you could do with that, some steps you can't do with that are going to lead to raising a better crop next year. So we wanted to talk about that just a little bit today.
Well, one of the big concerns that I have whenever we have a perennial growing out in a field and you want to raise something different next spring, maybe it's corn or soybeans or who knows what it's going to be. I want to get that perennial crop killed in the fall completely if possible, number one, so I don't have weed issues going into next year. But the big thing in our part of the world is moisture. When you have a crop like an alfalfa, for example, that's out in the field, taking in moisture and then it's still living in the spring, we normally will get some rain in the spring or we'll have some snow melt, and that moisture is very critical for our crop because we know we're going to get dry during the summer. If we've got a perennial crop that's growing out there in the spring and we have to wait till it has a decent amount of regrowth to try and kill it, it's going to take in a lot of water and some nutrients as well that could be beneficial for our crop. So getting that stopped in the fall is key for moisture preservation, depending on where you're at in the country.
So long story short, we want that alfalfa, we want that CRP dead now. Well, if you're going to go out there and use a strong rate of Roundup, let's say, that's been real popular in the past for controlling CRP or alfalfa stands that are coming out, you can do that. It's going to work great. The problem is if you spray after your hard-killing frost. You need to spray 1 to 2 weeks before your first hard-killing frost with Roundup, otherwise your control percentage is going to go way down. Okay, so if you've got grasses out there, even after the frost, I'd probably still try Roundup. That's going to be most likely your best bet. But if we're dealing with alfalfa, any legumes, any broadleaf at all that's out there, that's where you'd probably want to switch over to something like Banville or 2,4-D and run with a high rate. Don't run with an in-crop kind of rate. Like Banville, for example, you can run with a pint. That's the in-crop rate. But you know what we do on our farm? We go a quart. Well, then I know I'm going to get really good control.
You know, I don't know if I've ever been out in a CRP field that didn't have some broadleaf weeds and some grasses, and chances are both of them are either perennials or biennials, and that gets to be pretty tough. And when we get to the point where a farmer actually wants to take his alfalfa out, it's not because it's high production, it's not because it's weed free, it's because he's got quackgrass and thistles and dandelions and, you know, these tough perennial broadleaves and grasses out there. And I talk to a number of guys every year that say, well, I just want to use 2,4-D and try and wipe out my alfalfa. And I say, you know what, you might do okay on your alfalfa, but chances are if you've got some quackgrass and some other tough weeds out there, you're going to need the Roundup in the mix.
When you're looking at taking out these stands of whether it's CRP or alfalfa, you've got to consider too what you've done in the past. So did you use something in your CRP that could potentially harm a future crop? For example, a lot of guys, when they're getting that CRP going, after a few years, they start getting a few thistles out there, and then they talk to an agronomist who says, well, the very best thing on thistles is Milestone, or you could use Tordon or Grazon or Chaparral, something like that. So you go do that, and you think, well, it's in CRP, it's going to be in there for years and years. But what a lot of people don't even think about is with Tordon, for example, our standard rule is for every ounce of Tordon, it's 1 year of carryover. So if you used an equivalent of 8 ounces of Tordon, that's 8 years where you should not go back and plant a broadleaf crop in our recommendation. So what are you going to do next spring? Well, you got to think back to what have I done those past 8 or 10 years in that CRP ground. If you've used any Tordon, any Milestone, any Chaparral, there's no way I'd be planting any broadleaf crop like soybeans next spring.
Well, that's why a lot of people like to plant corn on that ground that's coming out of CRP, just because if they have a little bit of one of those Tordon or Milestone products from years back that carries over, it's probably not going to hurt corn if it was done quite a ways in the past, but on soybeans or a broadleaf type crop, it would definitely kill them. And on alfalfa, when I come out of alfalfa, I'm not worried about what herbicides got used in the alfalfa, but I am worried about some volunteer alfalfa coming. Even if you do a great job with your burn down, chances are there's going to be a little bit of alfalfa that does make it back. And when that alfalfa pops up, if you've got Status or you have Hornet that has Stinger in it, as broadleaf weed control options in your corn, well, you're going to do a nice job. Even in conventional corn, we can do a nice job cleaning up volunteer alfalfa.
However, one thing you've got to think about when you're talking corn here is you're going to have a lot of organic matter, a lot of residue out there. chances are much of your nitrogen that you apply is going to end up getting tied up. So that's why typically when we're coming out of CRP, we're going to tell you, I'd apply, if it was me, an extra 100 pounds of nitrogen above and beyond what you would normally do in a corn soybean rotation.
Now, we're going to get right into your cation exchange capacity and how much you can do at one time.
I'm not saying do it all in one time. I'm saying in total for the growing season, I'd get an extra 100 pounds out there. But it does change a little bit, so we talk very often about don't exceed what your soil will hold. Well, coming out of CRP, your soil is going to hold a bunch more than it did before it went into CRP.
True.
Because you've raised your organic matter levels, you've raised your overall residue levels.
And that residue is going to tie up a lot of that nitrogen too, because the bacteria are trying to break down that high carbon residue that's out there, and they're going to need nitrogen to be able to do that.
So it's a little bit different if it's coming out of alfalfa versus if it's coming out of CRP. So keep in mind, if it's coming out of CRP, you're going to need a lot more nitrogen than normal. Coming out of alfalfa, you probably aren't going to need any more nitrogen than normal, but it just depends on how much of that alfalfa was actually alfalfa or had it turned to a lot of grass by the time you're taking the stand out.
Well, the other thing to think about with either alfalfa coming out or CRP is you really need to do some soil testing out there. With alfalfa stands, what we see a lot is producers that aren't getting as much nutrition applied to that field as what the alfalfa is removing. And in that case, we're short, and we need to try and build that back up if we want to have a successful crop. In CRP, it may be a different issue. Who knows? It may be better than what you think. You just don't really know because you haven't been checking in most cases. I mean, who checks their CRP and goes out and soil samples during a 10-year contract or a longer contract? Nobody that I know. It gets sampled at the end of that before we start cropping again in those fields. So make sure you're doing good soil tests, and you probably want to do some grid sampling out in these fields, as if you haven't been managing them for a number of years, especially on the CRP side, you'll want to know where those differences lie.
Here's one last thing we want you to think about. Insects. Yes, you're not going to have corn rootworms, but you're probably going to have more wireworm problems and more white grub problems. So it's just something for you to keep in mind going into next spring.
Well, there are certainly a lot of considerations as you're taking a long-term alfalfa stand out, or if you're taking CRP out and going back to cropping. It's important that you talk to your agronomist about all the things you may have to consider to make sure that next year's crop could be successful.
Well, one of those things you may have to consider is controlling our weed of the week. Can you identify this week's weed?